Hi, everyone. Welcome to the It Hurts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today we're talking to DK Ciccone. DK is a certified Pilates instructor, Balanced Body NPCP, who helps people in pain improve strength, mobility, and well being in a weight neutral environment. Inspired by her own experiences with chronic low back pain, DK focuses on post rehab clients and chronic conditions. DK's studio, Movement Remedies, is located in Boston, Massachusetts. Her first book, You're Meant to Move, A Guide to Conquering Chronic Pain, Increasing Stress Resilience, and Reclaiming an Active Life, is coming out in December 2023. Thank you for coming on.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your own experiences with chronic pain.
Yeah. So like many of your guests before me, I had an experience that started when I was pretty young, and it's been really illuminating actually to listen to some other stories because I was only 13 the first time I had a really severe low back pain episode, and I always felt like such an oddball. And it turns out there's actually so many of us who were, for whatever reason, our nervous systems were initiating a pain response in our bodies at a young age. So for me, I was an aspiring dancer. I had big dreams. I wanted to be on Broadway. I grew up outside of New York City. And so got a chance to see Broadway shows, and I wanted that to be me. And I was actually performing in the musical Godspell in a summer community theater program. And it was really a fluke thing. I just had sort of a simple gesture. And then all of a sudden it was like a lightning bolt up my body. And, it was very fear provoking. I was on stage. I was actually in the middle of singing a solo and I was young. So I didn't know what to do in that moment. And, I made my way through the performance or whatever. And then after the fact, spent a few days on the living room floor with ice packs and heating packs under my back. And, I was young, and I think my parents didn't really know what to do at that point. It's not like I went through a car accident or anything that would be, an obvious cause for that sort of pain. So, we just kind of, I think I went to a chiropractor. They did some electric stim on me. I got better over time. And then it became sort of a pattern, and it was very unpredictable, and it would never be connected to any specific thing where it would suddenly come up. I'd spend days lying down on my back, and then it would resolve and I'd go back to doing what I was doing. But it was enough that I realized that, if I was going to be trying to be a dancer, it was probably not going to work out for me. Which is probably good because I didn't get a chance to realize that I probably wasn't really good enough to be on Broadway. I didn't have to experience that disappointment. But it really, it came and went. And then in my 20s, I had another pretty severe incident. And that's when I could barely walk and I lost feeling in my leg. And that's when I was diagnosed with a disc herniation. And, I was still young. I was in my mid-20s and went through a very familiar process that anyone who's gone through sort of a spinal injury like that can probably relate to, where the surgeon just looks at you and says, I don't know, we could operate. What do you think? And then they kind of send you to a PT, and then the PT sends you somewhere else. And, then you're still not feeling great. And then you go to a massage therapist, and maybe you try some alternative methods. And, eventually you just feel like a ping pong ball. And either people throw up their hands and say, I guess this is just the way it is. Or, they blame it on something like your weight or your stress or being oversensitive or something. And then they're kind of done with you. I mean, that was a huge motivator for me actually entering the corporate world in healthcare right after school. I was really frustrated with the way the system works, and I was hoping to make a difference from inside the healthcare system. And that led me down a path of, ever increasing intensity and stress in my workplace. I had, again, increasing repeated flare-ups that folks couldn't really explain. And then there was a point in my mid-30s where progressing signs of anxiety and progressing frequency of pain flare-ups sort of hit a crash course. And I was going through a lot in my personal life, and also was in a super, super toxic work environment that was very combative. And I started having daily panic attacks that were, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't function. And then at the same time had a really bad back flare up. And then I just said, enough is enough. I can't, something has to change. And it took me a while to figure out what that something was. And eventually, basically, I ended up deciding that, Pilates, which had been a big part of my pain management throughout my spinal issues, as a modality that really allowed me to feel mobile, and kind of reconnect to that movement side of my identity that was really important. But it also kept me safe and made me feel stronger. And so that was a big part of my pain management. And so it was a grounding aspect of my daily activities. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to pursue this as a teacher and see if I like it. And what I discovered, working with people, is that there were many people like me who had gone through various experiences and were, maybe they even had a major surgery, like a joint replacement. I work with a lot of joint replacement folks. And then they're allotted a certain number of physical therapy visits. And then the healthcare system says, oh, you must be better now. We decide, you can rotate your wrist this much, therefore you're ready to go back to work. And then they send you out, and then you're back in the world and you're still in pain. You don't know what to do. So I felt like there was this gap, especially after the physical therapy area. And especially for chronic pain folks like myself who just got bounced around and didn't really have a pathway. So movement remedies really came out of wanting to create a space that was explicitly for that community that felt kind of invisible, both in the medical system and in the fitness world. Like neither one of those caters effectively to the chronic pain community. And as you've rightly noted on your website, it's, 1 in 5 adults that experience chronic pain. I think it's more than 60% of people have a chronic condition. The rates are really high, and yet we're failing these populations miserably. So that is really my experience within my own body, but also what I've witnessed in other people has kind of promoted or provoked me to go down this path that I'm in right now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I actually tried Pilates once, probably 2 months ago, and what I found was, like, I've been so immobile for the last, like, 7 years that I couldn't do a lot of what they were doing, on the screen. So I kinda gave up, but I probably, I guess if I do it more, like, because I don't have this very much strength in my body anymore because I've just been so sedentary. But I guess I should give it another chance since it's just done so, wonders for you.
I assume it was a mat class if it was online.
Yes.
Was it specifically for people in pain, or is it just a regular class?
No, it was just a very like basic beginners Pilates class.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on how it's taught.
Mm.
And if you don't mind, I'll even take a moment to plug the fact that I have a low back and hip pain movement class available for free on my website,
Oh,
because I really try to focus on the moves that I have found to feel good in my body and also in other people's bodies when they have a tightness in their low back and hips. And, like you said, I mean, some of it, I think we give this perception that, oh, you had a hard time with the class, therefore it's because of an inherent weakness in you. And, I think that that's kind of unfair. And then that's really demotivating for people. The reality is that, first of all, it's like a stamina thing. So especially when you're dealing with
hmm.
multiple competing chronic conditions, I would start with like 10 to 15 minutes. I would never expect someone to just suddenly plop into a 50-minute class. And also, I think it's really important to have a teacher who understands pain and is able to offer you a class that meets your needs, that accommodates certain things. I mean, some people, it's like their wrists have arthritis or their hands have arthritis, and so certain positions are just like out of range. A lot of people have like neck issues. So half of the classical Pilates stuff, you're curling up your head 100 times. And so I have people just put a cushion under their head. It's like, why strain when you're still getting value? And so I think the important thing when I work with people is for them to walk into a class like what you're describing and to be able to tell in your own body, okay, here's the value I can extract from this exercise, even if I'm not doing it exactly the way the person on the screen is doing it, sort of understanding the inherent goals and then how you can make those goals accessible in your own body.
No, that makes sense. And I know it'd be a lot better if I were in a class and I had a teacher. I'm just trying to save money since, things are tight right now. But I definitely did. I think it was like 10 minutes. I didn't think I'd be able to have the stamina for a whole hour thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also tried like aquatic therapy. I've tried yoga
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, and I had the same problem. I've done physical therapy. I've done I forget what else I've done, but I've done, chiropractic, and like these things don't help. Like physical therapy, I tried two different times, two different kind of PT modalities, and everything seems to make me worse. So like what do you think is different about what you do?
Mm-hmm. Of course, I have a lot of questions. When you say it made you worse in the moment or worse after the fact?
Both.
Okay. And worse in specific places where you typically experience pain or sort of worse all over?
Definitely all over. Like it made the fibromyalgia worse, and I ended up having like hip flexor pain that I had never had before, and that has finally resolved after about 5 years. But I started having more pain in my joints and in my muscles and my nerves, and just kind of all over.
Hmm. Even with the aquatic therapy, huh?
I haven't done a whole lot of aquatic therapy. It's just really, maybe I should do that more because I think that's weight neutral, right?
Well, that's one that at least minimizes joint strain. It's a
Hmm.
stamina challenge, right? It's sort of like
Yeah.
which challenge do you want to tackle? I mean, so stamina wise, being active in a pool because the resistance is low, but it's constant.
Hmm.
So a pool can be really great if joint strain is your primary kind of challenge because it'll really minimize that because it's kind of all over equal pressure and it's not that doesn't have that pounding effect because you're kind of eliminating some of gravity's effect on you.
Hmm.
Also, it just feels nice because you can have that sort of weightlessness, especially if you get like a weight, like a belt, that like when I did aquatic therapy after my disc herniation and they had me wear a little belt that kind of gave me more flotation. So then I could sort of move around in the pool. Um, so I think that there's a couple things. So fibromyalgia is challenging when it comes to exercise because where we have trouble with fibromyalgia is when we push too hard. So there's definitely like a consistency but low resistance approach for working with fibromyalgia, where you want to make sure that everything has a chance to move, but fibromyalgia might not react super well to like an extra load or weight in the body. Whereas something like arthritis, especially osteoarthritis, can respond really well when I add resistance, but it doesn't want a lot of repetition. So,
Hmm.
arthritis in the joints, if I ask someone to do, 50 versions of a squat, eventually the kind of the rubbing inside the joint is going to kind of catch up. So I think just kind of knowing what your triggers are is really important. And so, what I talk about in the book is figuring out first what are your refuge movements, and I call them refuge movements because they're sort of something that you can go to that creates a sense of safety in your body, because ultimately pain is your brain's way of telling you there's a threat. So it could be real or perceived. And I love what you wrote on your site too about how you had to kind of come to terms with the fact that pain was actually something that was trying to tell you something, and it was positive. And that was really hard for me to come to terms with. I think it's hard for a lot of people to kind of recognize, like, befriend the pain, because the pain is actually, we've evolved to survive when things are on fire and we stick our hand in them. And then pain happens and we take our hand out. I mean, if that didn't happen, we would just burn, and be injured. Same thing with like an infection. If you didn't have pain associated with an infection could very easily take your life. So something in the calibration, and we could of course go down the path of talking about why that is, why the nervous system has reached this hypervigilant state. What are some of the characteristics that might lead to a person being in a nervous system state where everything feels very fearful, even if it's just a feather touch. So I think doing that work internally to experiment with movements and find the ones that really feel safe, even if they're so simple, even if it's moving your hands or lifting your toes, and it could be very simple. And then starting from there and like working from your refuge, and then adding things that feel a little bit more insurmountable, because all of the research supports the fact that movement, your tissues and your muscles and your joints, they do crave mobility. What we have to figure out is, how do we get that mobility in a way that doesn't provoke a conditioned response in the body where, for whatever reason, we have associated movement with a danger. And some of that, as you've mentioned before, is unresolved trauma, or things that we have. Sometimes sitting still is an opportunity to sit with your emotions that you would rather not sit with. And so I think being willing to be non-judgmental with yourself. I don't know, would you call yourself a kind of a perfectionist or a self-critical person?
Extremely.
Yeah. So that's very common among chronic pain sufferers. And that's part of what makes the movement part so hard, because you really have to figure out how to let it go and recognize that any amount of movement, however small, is a win. It doesn't have to be a challenge. Like, no pain, no gain is absolutely out the door. Like, it needs to be gone. And allowing yourself to define movement in a way that may not be the typical gym or fitness class. Maybe for you, it's a peaceful walk outside, or maybe it's, some kind of activity that you can do with your child, or maybe it's, brushing your hair in the morning, which is, itself a work of muscles, you know what I mean? And figuring out, okay, these are things that I can do that exert my body in some way, but bring me a sense of soothing in my nervous system. And that has to be the starting point, because if you go into a movement situation and you've already told yourself, like I heard you say, well, I knew I probably could only do 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you kind of went into it with like, I'm going to fail at this. Instead of saying, I'm going to get something good at it. And I'm not judging you, Lauren, please. No, I'm just using that as an example, because I have also been there. And using that as an example of how we could just you change your thoughts, which changes your actions, which changes your outcomes, right? So if we can start to think of it as, I'm going to get something great out of this, even if it's just lying on my back on a mat for 10 minutes and having a sense of peacefulness and breathing with the instructor, even if I'm not doing very much. Or what can I learn about my body today? Like, what is this going to teach me about my body today? And also figure out, maybe your refuge movements are what you use for recovery. So it's not just exercise and be done, but sometimes we need to find those soothing activities, whatever they are. And if it's a heating pad, or if it's a meditation technique, or something that really you can count on to bring your nervous system back to a state of calm after you've challenged it in a way, and then building from there, because as you gain confidence, movement will become more easy. And then at some point, after we've tried all of those things, there is some element of accepting the fact that movement is objectively beneficial, even if it causes some pain. And I know that is really difficult. And obviously only you can decide what level of pain is acceptable in your body. but I have never had someone come to me during an acute flare-up of CRPS or whatever pain they're dealing with. I always have them come in. I won't let them cancel, or I mean, I'll let them cancel, but I'll say, I promise you can come in and we'll find something to do. I've never had someone come in that situation and not be glad that they came, because just a little bit of movement releases those chemicals in the body that, are feel good chemicals. It gets the blood flow, it reduces inflammation. There's just a million reasons why it supports the immune system and digestion. And there's just it's cardiovascular health. I mean, my big argument is I'm also on a whole thing about let's stop talking about weight loss. I'm just so over it. Like, let's be done. But if you had to pick one health promoting behavior in your whole life to focus on, it would be movement, because it touches on stress and mental health. It touches on all of the systems of the body, and it really, really is valuable. And sleep.
Okay.
How does that sound? Does that feel a little bit tough?
I mean, it does, but I mean, everything I've read, supports exactly what you're saying, that our bodies are meant to move. And like you said, they crave movement. So, I mean, it makes sense. It's just really hard to implement in real life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So one thing I struggle with is like if I'm doing any kind of activity, whether it's trying to exercise or something else, like and it I start to hurt. Like, when do I know if it's just a good challenge for my body, or if it's actually means like I should stop or modify the task?
Yeah. So if you start to hurt, a good thing to do is to pause in that moment. And so one of the other things that I've done training in is pain reprocessing therapy. And are you familiar with Alan Gordon and the Way Out book?
Yeah.
So
Yes, I
it's
haven't
based,
read it yet, but it's been recommended a few times.
yeah. So he uses somatic tracking as his main, or I should say the training course uses somatic tracking as a main way to deal with recurring pain. And so what that really means is, like, let's say you're in the middle of exercising and then you feel a pain. You kind of close your eyes and you focus on the pain, and you try not to focus like you're, Sherlock Holmes and, you're like intensely trying to get to the bottom of it, but just kind of neutralizing it. Like, okay, I have a feeling in my body and it's not a pleasant feeling. And I don't know why it's showing up. Because I think one of the things that happens when you're moving and pain comes up is, if you're anything like me, is it's all the like, why, and then the guilt, I did it to myself, or I'm so stupid, I shouldn't have pushed so hard, or whatever. There's like so much negative talk in here. And so to try that in of itself is a challenge, but to sit and like focus on it in a neutral way, and almost like he talks about kind of, maybe you're at an aquarium and it's like it's a shark and the shark is in the tank. It can't really hurt you. It's just kind of floating around. And then see if the pain moves. See if the pain changes. And 9 times out of 10, if you just kind of watch it and just sit with it, it will often shape shift. Like, it'll be like, oh, okay, now it's over here. And then, oh, okay, now it's in my leg. And when that happens, that is 100% evidence that there's nothing wrong with you, that it's your nervous system that's just misfiring for whatever reason. And so I would say, if it starts to dissipate or change, then you can kind of say, okay, and move on. If instead your focus on it makes it intensify and it becomes like a throbbing or a stabbing or an 8 out of 10 or whatever you've decided your level is, then I would go to your refuge, whatever that is, if it's child's pose, if it's a meditation, and I would just take a break and give yourself grace. So I think it's important to remind ourselves what our diagnoses are. If physicians have cleared us for movement, and we have to remind ourselves there's nothing about this that can hurt me. If you started to experience pain while you were dangling off a ridge while rock climbing, like, I might have questions, like maybe don't do this. But if you're just doing something gentle with no mechanical force, like, there's really nothing bad that can happen to you. And I think internalizing that takes a lot of time. So I think, that's somatic, I would read that book. It's very quick read. And see if some of those practices, those sort of internal meditative practices, help bring you some more clarity on how lasting the pain really is. And then allow yourself to take a rest and really don't hold the shame of that.
Yeah, I'm definitely working on the giving myself grace part. I think I'm getting a lot better at it. I used to be really self-critical, and if I couldn't do something, I would just feel so much shame and guilt. And my husband has
Mm.
helped me a lot through that because, he and my daughter both, they just remind me, it's not your fault. It's okay. You can't control it, blah, blah, blah. And so I definitely give myself a lot more grace than I used to. So I think those are really interesting practices. I'll definitely get that book. I think I'm gonna either get it on payday or request it for Christmas, one of the two. And kind of speaking of like doing activities that cause pain, so I like avoid activities, some activities,
Mm.
sometimes, not always, but like a lot of times when I unload the dishwasher, it flares up my back. So there are days where I'm afraid to unload the dishwasher because I'm afraid it's going to flare up my back. So like how do I kind of overcome this fear, or do I just, what do I do in this situation?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And just out of curiosity, have you ever had a clinician or someone tell you that bending over at the waist is bad for your back?
No.
Okay. Because I have, and that caused me a ton of fear. And I also went through a period of avoiding the dishwasher. So I'm glad that hasn't happened to you. So this is a great example of what I would call, so we talked about refuge movements, which is these
Hmm.
movements that you build as like a repertoire of safety and soothing of your nervous system. And a lot of us who didn't have nurturing or successful nurturing mechanisms as children, we don't do a good job of self-soothing. And so part of of this is kind of discovering that as well. Now, the other side of the coin is your reach movements. What are the things that are sort of that feel out of reach for you? Things that are that spark fear, things that you avoid, as you mentioned. So this is actually specifically a journal activity inside my book. So in the case of something like bending over to do the dishwasher, I would not now throw yourself into bending over and doing the dishwasher. So that is actually a deceptively difficult movement because you are bent forward in a loaded position in your spine that feels very vulnerable, and you're adding a little weight, right? You're holding something and you're moving around. So I could totally see that. That's like a super common one. So what I would do is I would break it into pieces. So I would practice bending over some amount with not the dishwasher anywhere in sight, just somewhere else. And you can do that with support. You can do it with an exercise ball behind your back. You can do it with cushions behind your back. You can do it on the floor. You can do it in cat cow, and then start to increase your range little by little. And then maybe you start to add holding something, something super light. And then you kind of add to it. And then you start practicing separately, maybe on your hands and knees, a movement where you're kind of stretching into your hands and fingers, side to side, because that's also part of the dishwasher. It's like this side to side movement. So what you're doing is you're loading your quadratus lumborum, which are these muscles at the sides of your back that are like the number one thing that gets mad when we injure ourselves, and they tend to spasm if overloaded. So we were practicing with them, maybe we do a little rotation, and we're doing it all in a super, maybe even on your back, like a super non-invasive way where you're changing your relationship to gravity, and you're creating the range of motion, and you're creating a sense of safety. And then you build up over time with increasing intensity to the point where, okay, now we're going to bend over, we're going to pick something up, and then we're going to come back. We're not even at the dishwasher yet. And then once that feels safe, then you can do the dishwasher and maybe just do like a cup, and we start there. So I really believe in breaking things down that much where you can practice, you kind of break it into pieces and practice it in a completely non-provoking place and space. and then bring everything back. Because the bottom line is, Lauren, if we don't use functional movements like that, we will lose them. So the things that we avoid are really key to our independence as we age. And you don't want to then be, in your 50s and 60s, like trying to reclaim the ability to bend over and put your shoes on. So that's why I really, really emphasize that, those kinds of functional movements and making sure we keep them in our movement vocabulary. And it feels like, insurmountable to try to tackle something like that. And it takes time, but I think doing it piecemeal and then building up to it, I think you'll find that you can get there.
And I like that because like there are days I literally lie in bed all day completely overwhelmed by having to go do dishes. Like literally I
Mm.
am paralyzed, my anxiety is so high, and I'm like I can't even get out of bed because I'm so afraid to go do that. So starting so simply, I think is a really interesting concept, and then building up to it. And that way, like my body feels and my body feels and my mind knows that like it's going to be safe, especially if I build up to it and just do it like in pieces because I don't have to do the whole thing all at the same time. I've got all day long to do it.
Yes, yes. But also if you try to just throw yourself into the task, it's just going to you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're now reinforcing the conditioned response of
Mm-hmm.
dishes are terrifying and painful. So to whatever degree you can, delegate that or find ways around it, I think it's important to not do it until you feel safe doing it rather than like reinforcing that thing. And, even in your bed, like rolling to one side and then back and rolling to the other side and back and seeing if you can just kind of have gentle rotation. I really believe in making sure that you, and especially with like disc generation and stuff like that, making sure that you move in all planes. So you get a little forward, backward, a little side to side, a little rotation. And, even if it's small movements, it just gets, the range of motion maintained and the ligaments and joints warmed up in all the places. But what you're describing is it's so relatable, I think, for so many people. And then, I think it's no coincidence that, we've had chronic pain experiences, so many of us in this community, chronic pain experiences and anxiety experiences. Because I mean, I draw the parallel between when I cannot control a thing, panic attack like is guaranteed. I mean, I find my ways around it in my own, whatever, we all have our ways, but that's a huge trigger for folks who feel like they can't for when they have anxiety, when they can't control something. And so chronic pain is sort of your worst nightmare because it shows up when you don't know. And it shows up also maybe at times when you like really want to be there for someone that you love. So then you're piling on the like, I'm ineffective in my role as a parent. I'm ineffective in my role in my job. And I can't control it. And so, the danger signals are just over the top. So it really is about figuring out how to be successful in both of those realms at the same time. They really do feed each other. And I think you've mentioned the body keeps the score before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have an answer for that on how to tackle all the things. If you find a magic, I listened to the CBD episode. Maybe I need to try some of that. But there's a lot of pieces to it.
Right. And there's also like a huge connection that I've been learning. Like the longer I've been doing this podcast, the more people I have come on and talk about the mind body connection, how just incredibly important that is when it comes to chronic pain. So, can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So that's a great segue from the body keeps the score because he talks a
Mm-hmm.
lot about dissociation and how the people who have gone through traumatic experiences and some of these vets and child abuse survivors that he's talked to have this experience of feeling a numbness, either emotionally or physically. And so, as a way of being able to cope with situations and that are emotionally overwhelming, we have a tendency to break that connection. And so, and I don't even mean, it doesn't have to be trauma with a big T. It could be trauma with a little t, you know, things that happen in your life where you feel out of control or you feel neglected or abandoned, you know, can put you into a situation where your nervous system is trying to tell you something about your feelings. You know, like I had really horrible stomach aches as a kid. And, you know, now knowing what I know and knowing my childhood situation, I recognize now that that was 100% anxiety. I also had asthma, and that was anxiety showing up in my body. And I do believe that when the pain did flare initially, it was anxiety, and it took me 30 years to figure it out. So sometimes those symptoms are just, they're inconvenient because when we pay attention to them, maybe it raises an emotional thing that we can't or don't want to deal with, or for our own survival, we need to stifle. And so we tend to just break that connection. And this is one of the reasons that I also believe that chronic dieting has a huge link to chronic pain, because for so many of us who as young people believed that we needed to restrict our intake of food in order to make a shape that the rest of the world was happy with, you know, we trained ourselves to completely ignore hunger as a physical signal. And so you stuff it down, you learn how to work past it, to drink sparkling water or eat popcorn or whatever you can do to kind of fake it out. And so by the time you get into your adulthood, you have now lost all of your connection to your, like I call it, your early warning system. So I'm not listening anymore to my body. My body is throwing up signals and flares like you're under too much pressure, or you're in your abusive relationship, or you're in a toxic work environment, and it's showing up as GI distress or acid or headaches or whatever. And I'm just not paying attention to them because I have developed this kind of disconnected, like my body has its own thing going on and my mind is stronger or something, that like mind over mind control idea, you know, like I'm just gonna be a warrior through my brain. And from my experience, the healing does not happen until you reconnect that, to rewire your early warning system so that you do feel. And it sucks at first. I mean, you feel stuff that you maybe didn't even know was undermining your sense of security. And you have to make room to sit with those things and to tell those stories and to nurture that inner child. And so one of the ways I know that I'm working with a client who has stuff to deal with is when a great example is someone whose story I talk about in my book. And he is a former Navy diver, super strong, went through really intense training, also went through some traumatic things in his experience in the Navy doing underwater rescue, was hit head on by a drunk driver. And his living through that was an absolute miracle. So he's got tremendous trauma in his body. And when we first started working, you know, I would say, where do you feel the work? Where do you feel, you know, where do you feel this exercise? And it's like, I don't know. I don't feel anything, you know, it's, you know, nothing. And when people start telling me they don't feel anything, that's when I know, you know, that there's a disconnect between their mind and body. And we have to figure out how to get them in their body so that they can actually sense when they're in a state of fear, because it's that fear, pain, stress cycle that we have to break in chronic pain in order to find triumph in movement. So, you know, one of the first things that we do is really try to dig into that. And if, you know, maybe we need to move more slowly, maybe we need to, I might use my hands to try to say, okay, here's the area of your body that is working right now. Like, can you feel it now that my hand is there? To rebuild that sensation, where you have like sensations that I think of it as, you know, telecommunications wires that got cut down. Like we have to figure out how to reconnect them. And then once you have that feedback loop, now you can kind of work through that reach and refuge stuff in a way where you know you're getting real-time accurate information.
And you may have already answered my next question, or you may have more to say, I'm not sure. But so you talked about like weight loss and how that, that causes you to kind of stop paying attention to your body's signals. What are the damaging effects of like current weight loss advice, and how does that relate to chronic pain?
So this is again sort of anecdotal, because this is my own hypothesis from my own experience and what I've witnessed with people. But I mean, first of all, it is basically understood at this point that weight loss does not work long term. I mean, dieting is
Mm-hmm.
not effective, and it's as silly as telling someone, if you drink my green juice for 30 days, you'll have green eyes. Like, that's a genetic thing. I'm not going to make your eyes different unless I put contacts on them. So with the idea that we're supposed to be living up to some ideal body that was defined, by a very narrow audience ages ago, and that they've just been selling us, for a long time and making a heck of a lot of money doing it, it's all nonsense. So I think it's damaging in a couple ways. I mean, I talked about the fact that it encourages a disconnect between your mind and body. It encourages a sense of distrust in your body. So this
Mm-hmm.
idea that, my body is not showing up in the way that I want it to, and therefore I hate it. I know I've had, especially as a young person, and when I did believe I was going to be a dancer, and I didn't look like the typical dancer, I had a lot of talk inside about, why can't you just, look like so and so? They have a body that the theater producer likes, and if you weren't so fat, you would have gotten that role, or whatever. And so there's this negative monologue that just gets kicked up, and it's very, very difficult to dismantle. And so once the pain started, it was like, oh, there you go again, being a failure, not being what I needed. I needed you to not be in pain. I needed you to show up, and you just can never show up for me in the way that I need you to. And so it just creates this alter ego, almost as if your body isn't you. And yet at the same time, our bodies carry us through tremendous physical and mental burden. Your body gave life to a human. I mean, when I hear women come in after having babies and then they tell me, oh, they really wanted, they wish that they had a body, that was different. It's like, you successfully brought life into this world. I mean, our messaging is absolutely destructive to women in particular around what their bodies are supposed to look like. But the other thing that I think I see most often, and that's most relevant to the topic of pain, is that I've had tons of people come to me where they went to their physician and said, I'm in a lot of pain in XYZ place. And the person took one look at them and said, oh, we'll lose some weight. The world's laziest diagnosis. I think that you go to a doctor and they feel like they have to say something. And chronic pain is such a complex, multifactorial problem that they can't address with one drug, that it's just easier to say, well, if you just weighed less, then you would be fine. And I mean, I have a client who had severe hip arthritis, and they basically told her, you just need to lose weight, and also wanted her to lose weight before having joint replacement surgery. And it turns out that she actually had an anatomical situation in which the femur head didn't really fit correctly in her pelvis. So she was just guaranteed to have major arthritis. And she's now had a bilateral hip replacement and is doing phenomenal, walking thousands of steps a day, because she's also internalized a story about, because you internalize a story about yourself about, well, the pain is my fault. Mm. Just like the weight was my fault because I couldn't resist the brownie or whatever. I was addicted to food, which is like another one of the world's most catastrophic phrases that ever came out of the wellness industry. Now we have a situation where you feel like I'm the reason I'm in pain. And so that leaves you, what it does detrimentally is it stops you from seeking, because you're like, I'm the problem. So why would I continue to seek help? And I believe that there's part of why my business is called Movement Remedies is because I have a dream of having a large space where you can visit all kinds of different practitioners who do things for pain, because on different days you need different things. You need a whole toolbox. So if you stop seeking and trying to find that thing that you love that helps you, you're not going to get better. You see, and then you've also just internalize this narrative about yourself that's really negative, that just contributes to shame and guilt and self-criticism, which then sends your nervous system into a further downward spiral of like, I'm inside a vessel that is bad for me. And it's just no good comes of it. No good comes of giving people, advice that they need to lose weight in order to feel better, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I really resonate with all of that because like when my body first started hurting all over, I mean I was very angry at my body. I was like my body is betraying me in my mid 30s, and I used to be really really skinny, like underweight all the time, and then I had a baby. I turned 40 and I got sedentary, so I've gained a lot of weight and I feel the same way, like my body is betraying me. But I really do need to kind of change my thought process. Like my body is an amazing work of art and work of science that like I don't fully even understand. And I think, just listening to you, I really need to work on that. So thank you for that.
Oh, friend, we all do. I mean, even as adamant as I get about it, it's a daily struggle for me. It's daily. And it's not like we're going to undo 40 years of conditioning, with 5-minute meditations. I mean, it is a daily struggle. And the really sad thing about it is that, again, the diet industry is massively lucrative, and they're not going to stop pushing this message anytime soon. It's just too beneficial for them, for their pockets. So I like to say that choosing to love your body the way that it is, choosing to support yourself and to make decisions daily that support your self-care is like an act of rebellion, because you're swimming upstream. And so when the world feels crazy and your wish that you could make a difference of, in the world, of making it a better place, I really think starting with just loving yourself is itself like a mini revolution. And it's no easy feat, especially with social media and, comparison and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like Theodore Roosevelt, I think, that said comparison is the thief of joy. It's just so true.
And he wasn't even on Instagram yet.
I know, this was before all of that
I know.
craziness. So like what's one maybe big piece of advice that you'd give to people living with chronic pain?
The advice I would give, I think I would go back to the fact that movement of any kind is the number one thing for you to focus on when it comes to promoting health outside of your pain. And so figuring out the way to incorporate movement in your life of any kind, even if it's 5 minutes a day, is of absolute paramount importance, because whatever movements you choose to avoid, you will eventually lose them completely. And that leads to a life of dependence on others. And that's a whole nother like ball game when you start to age. So I think, leaning on your community, starting small, and finding ways to move that light you up, whatever they are. If it's, a dance party in your kitchen, if it's gardening, I mean, it doesn't have to be in a gym, with a tank top on for it to be movement, but consistency over duration matters tremendously. So I actually offer 25-minute private sessions. And I find that I was surprised. It's actually my most popular private session as opposed to the full 50 minutes. And not just because it's cheaper, but because my folks with, MS or autoimmune disease, that 25 minutes is plenty for them to get exercise in, and it allows them to be consistent as opposed to burning themselves out with an hour of exercise and then feeling wiped out for 3 days. So, and building up to 25 might even still be long, but it really matters to do a little bit every day, and also to figure out what your biggest obstacles are to being able to implement that. If it's a sense of guilt that you should be taking care of your family instead, if it's having a hard time holding yourself accountable to goals you make for yourself because you don't believe inherently that you're actually worth it and deserving of feeling good in your body, we have to do that excavation and then enlist a friend or someone to help you stay true, because you will show up as the best version of yourself if you feel as good in your body as you can. So that's probably like 18 pieces of advice, but
That's okay. We'll roll it into one. So where can we find out more about you and your practice and your book?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm at movementremedies.org. I'm also mostly on Instagram at movement_remedies. And if you want to know about the book, you can go to you'rementtomove.com. But there's also mention of it on the website. So, and I would encourage folks to go to movementremedies.org, and you'll see a link right there to get a free class that's specifically for low back and hip pain, as I mentioned, and see if there's pieces of that feel good in your body that you can reuse. It's a recorded class. And I also do work virtually. I have 2 mat classes a week. It's called Restorative Pilates, and it's oriented, everyone who comes in my doors is in pain in some way, so it's oriented around folks in pain. I do have virtual attendance available. It's a hybrid, so that's Wednesdays at 6 p.m. and Saturdays at 10 a.m. So I do work virtually with folks as well, and all my sign up information is on there. But honestly, I'm just so passionate about this topic. Like, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd love to hear your stories about, what would be helpful for you in trying to find movement in your life. And, if someone hasn't told you today, you're a warrior. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
And make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any health, parenting, or life advice. For my freebie 30 ways to relieve pain without taking a pill, go to ithurtstomom.com/tips. If you have comments, suggestions, or want to be on this podcast, email me at ithurtstomom@gmail.com. Have a blessed and pain-free day.